My manhood is the only way to your blessings. All you need to do is to believe and allow the power of God flow through me into your body. The village of Doli had fallen under the spell of a man named Gazaniga. He wasn't a traditional pastor, but he called himself a prophet. In fact, he was known as the spiritual commander. His sermons were captivating, and he claimed to have powers no one else had. God speaks directly to me, he would say, his voice low and commanding. And through my body, miracles can happen. Gazaniga was tall, with a booming voice that could silence a crowd. When he spoke, people listened. His sermons were captivating, full of dramatic pauses and powerful declarations. God has chosen me, he would say, his eyes scanning the crowd, making everyone feel as though he were speaking directly to them. Through me, you will find salvation, healing, and blessings beyond your imagination. But there was something unsettling about his words. Unlike the other pastors and prophets who came before him, Gazaniga's message was different. He didn't just preach about faith or good deeds. He claimed that his body held divine power, specifically his manhood. God communicates through me, Gazaniga would say, his voice low and intense. And if you seek his blessings, you must trust me completely, for only through my manhood will you receive his miracles. The villagers were both awed and confused by his words, but they trusted him. Over time, Gazaniga's influence grew. Women, in particular, began visiting him privately, seeking his help for all kinds of problems: sick relatives, barren lands, financial struggles. Whatever the issue, Gazaniga promised a solution. But there was always a price. Trust in my power, he would tell them. But remember, the blessings of God flow through me, and only through my body will you receive his favor. It wasn't long before strange stories began to spread throughout the village. A woman named Aduki, who had been unable to conceive for years, suddenly became pregnant after a private session with Gazaniga. Another woman's crops, which had been withering and dying, suddenly flourished after she met with him. People were in awe. They marveled at Gazaniga's miracles, and soon he became the most revered man in the village. But beneath the surface, not everyone was convinced. Babatunde, the oldest man in the village, had seen many prophets come and go in his time. He had watched how Gazaniga manipulated the people, especially the women, and something about the so-called miracles didn't sit right with him. But Babatunde knew better than to speak out with evidence. The villagers were too enchanted by Gazaniga's words, and accusing him without proof would only turn them against him. Still, Babatunde watched and waited. He knew that if Gazaniga's power was based on lies, the truth would eventually come out. Meanwhile, Gazaniga continued his reign over the village. More and more women visited him, seeking his supposed divine intervention. Many of them left his home with tears in their eyes, but none dared speak about what had happened behind closed doors. They were afraid of losing the blessings they believed they had received, and afraid of what Gazaniga might do if they told the truth. Then one day, something happened that no one could ignore. A young girl named Bola, no older than 16 years, went to Gazaniga seeking help for her sick mother. Bola's family was poor, and her mother had been bedridden for weeks. Desperate and out of options, Bola went to Gazaniga, hoping that the prophet could perform one of his famous miracles. Gazaniga welcomed her with open arms, his smile warm and reassuring. "Do not fear, my child," he said, placing his hands on her shoulder. "Your mother will be healed, but you must trust me completely. God's power flows through me, and I can help you, but you must first believe." Bola, naive and desperate, nodded. She followed Gazaniga into his house, where he began to speak in his usual mysterious and commanding tone. "To heal your mother, you must allow God's power to flow through you," he said, his voice low. "And the only way to do that is through my manhood. You must trust me, for only through me will you find the miracle you seek." Bola's heart pounded in her chest. Something felt wrong, but she didn't know what to do. She had heard of Gazaniga's powers, how he had helped so many women in the village. Could he really heal her mother? Could he be trusted? As Bola hesitated, Gazaniga grew impatient. He moved closer, his hands reaching for her. "Do not doubt me, child," he said, his voice growing stern. "You came to me for help, and this is the way. If you want your mother to live, you must do as I say." Just as Gazaniga was about to take things too far, there was a loud crash at the door. Bola's father, who had become worried when she didn't return home, had followed her to Gazaniga's house. The sight of his daughter inside, terrified and cornered by the prophet, ignited a fury in him like no other. Without hesitation, Bola's father stormed into the room, pulling his daughter away from Gazaniga. "What are you doing?" "I was performing spiritual cleansing on her. But since you have come for her, then I guess you are not ready for your wife to be healed," Gazaniga replied. The man wanted to retaliate, but he was scared of Gazaniga, as he was considered a powerful preacher. He took her daughter and never returned to Gazaniga for help. Dear viewer, isn't it shocking to hear that a man's manhood can transmit God's power? Days passed, and Prophet Gazaniga, aka Prophet Spiritual Commander, performed his duties as usual. Miracles were happening in his church, as even one time, a woman who was barren for 12 years became pregnant after her encounter with the prophet. A 25-year-old lady who was in search of a job got a job after her encounter with the prophet. Some days later, a woman whose child was in search of a scholarship to study abroad came to the prophet to seek assistance because she believed the prophet's prayer could open the scholarship door for her child. Therefore, she came for counseling with her 17-year-old beautiful daughter. When they entered Gazaniga's office, Gazaniga asked the woman to wait behind, as he only needs the young lady in the room so he can communicate with the angel in charge of her scholarship and then transfer the power to her child. The woman agreed and went outside. However, After some minutes, the woman heard sounds coming from the room. Initially, she thought perhaps the prophet was performing the deliverance as usual. But the sounds became much more intense and sounded more like a cry for help. She quickly rushed in to check what was happening, and to her surprise, Prophet Gazaniga was on top of her child, trying to remove her underwear. The woman screamed for help, and people began to rush in to check what was happening. As people gathered to check what was happening, to their surprise, Gazaniga was only wearing boxers. The woman spoke angrily towards Gazaniga. "You call yourself a man of God, but you are nothing more than a monster." She explained everything to the villagers who had gathered outside Gazaniga's office. As the truth began to unravel, the people were horrified. Women who had visited Gazaniga in the past began to speak out, their voices trembling with fear and shame. They told of how he had used his position to take advantage of them, convincing them that his manhood was the only way to receive God's blessings. The village was in shock. The man they had trusted, the man they had revered as a prophet, was nothing more than a fraud. The men in the village, outraged by the betrayal, seized Gazaniga and dragged him to the village square. The crowd was furious. Mothers wept for their daughters, and fathers clenched their fists in anger. Babatunde, who had long suspected that something was wrong, stepped forward. "This man has deceived us all," he said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "He preyed on our faith, our trust, and our desperation. But no more. His lies end today." As the villagers called for justice, the local authorities were summoned. Gazaniga, once the most powerful man in the village, was now a broken figure. His head hung low in shame. The truth had finally caught up with him, and there was no escape. The authorities arrived and arrested Gazaniga for his crimes. The villagers watched as he was taken away, their faces a mix of feeling and sadness. They had been fooled, but now they knew the truth. Gazaniga's reign of deception was over, and the village of Doli could begin to heal. As the dust settled, Babatunde addressed the people once more. "Let this be a lesson to us all," he said. "We must never place our trust so blindly in one man. True power comes from God, and no one man holds the key to God's blessings." The villagers nodded in agreement, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had happened. Gazaniga's name would forever be a warning, a reminder of how easily faith could be twisted and used for evil. And so, the story of Gazaniga, the fake prophet, came to an end. His lies had been exposed, and justice had been served. But the scars he left behind would remain for years to come, a testament to the dangers of blind faith and unchecked power.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.